What started as a routine morning patrol in the Indian jungle turned into the most extraordinary wildlife encounter ever recorded. But this isn't just a story about one man saving a tiger. It's about what happened when 5 tigers decided to return the favor. The mist clung to the dense canopy of the Sundarbans as David Chen stepped out of his weathered jeep, the familiar weight of his ranger equipment settling across his shoulders. 3 years had passed since he'd traded his military fatigues for the khaki uniform of a wildlife conservationist. But the transition from serving his country to protecting India's endangered species felt like a natural evolution rather than a complete departure from his previous life. At 42, David carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to read danger in both human conflict zones and the untamed wilderness. The surgical scar running along his left forearm, a memento from his final deployment in Afghanistan, had long since faded to a thin white line that he barely noticed anymore. What hadn't faded was his ability to remain calm under pressure, a skill that had served him well in his new role patrolling one of the world's most dangerous tiger reserves. The morning air was thick with humidity and the earthy scent of decomposing vegetation that carpeted the jungle floor. David's boots squelched softly in the muddy trail as he began his inspection of the northwestern sector, an area that had recently shown increased tiger activity according to the camera trap data. His radio crackled occasionally with updates from other rangers spread across the vast reserve, their voices providing reassuring confirmation that he wasn't entirely alone in this primordial landscape. Birds called from the canopy above, the harsh cry of a fish eagle, the melodic trill of a paradise flycatcher, the distant drumming of a woodpecker working steadily at some dead tree trunk. These sounds had become David's morning symphony, as familiar and comforting as the reveille bugle calls that had once awakened him in military barracks around the world. He paused to check his GPS coordinates, noting that he was approaching the area where researchers had recently documented a female tiger with 2 cubs. The jungle seemed particularly alive this morning, with fresh pug marks visible in the soft earth and the distinctive musk scent of big cats lingering in several locations along the trail. David's trained eye automatically cataloged these signs, building a mental map of recent tiger movements that would contribute to the ongoing research efforts aimed at protecting these magnificent predators. He had no way of knowing that within the next hour, his understanding of tiger behavior would be challenged in ways that no amount of training could have prepared him for. The first sign that something was wrong came as a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. David froze mid-step, his hand instinctively moving to the tranquilizer gun secured at his hip. The sound was unfamiliar, not the territorial roar of a tiger, nor the trumpeting call of an elephant. This was something else entirely, a deep, guttural noise that spoke of raw aggression and imminent violence. Through the dense undergrowth ahead, David caught a flash of movement, orange and black stripes weaving frantically between the trees. A tiger, but not moving with the usual grace and purpose he'd observed countless times before. This animal was running, and the desperation in its movements suggested it wasn't hunting, but fleeing. The rumbling sound intensified, accompanied now by the distinctive crash of something massive forcing its way through the vegetation with complete disregard for the delicate ecosystem around it. David's military training kicked in as he quickly assessed the situation, moving off the main trail and positioning himself behind a large sal tree that would provide both cover and a clear vantage point of whatever was unfolding ahead. What he saw next defied everything he thought he knew about wildlife behavior in the reserve. A magnificent Bengal tiger, its coat gleaming with sweat and moisture from the humid air, burst into a small clearing approximately 50 meters from David's position. The animal was clearly exhausted, its sides heaving with labored breathing, but what struck David most was the way it kept looking back over its shoulder, as if calculating whether it had enough distance from whatever was pursuing it. The answer came thundering into view moments later. A massive Indian rhinoceros, easily weighing over 2 tons, emerged from the tree line with the unstoppable momentum of a living battering ram. Its single horn, worn to a deadly point from years of territorial disputes, was lowered and aimed directly at the tiger. The rhino's small eyes burned with an inexplicable fury that seemed completely disproportionate to any normal territorial dispute between species that rarely competed for resources.
David had witnessed plenty of predator-prey dynamics during his time in the reserve, but this was something entirely different. Rhinos were typically placid creatures, content to graze and wallow in muddy pools. They might charge if threatened or protecting young, but this level of sustained aggression toward a tiger was unprecedented. The tiger, meanwhile, appeared to be favoring its left hind leg, a subtle limp that became more pronounced as it tried to maintain distance from its massive pursuer. Whatever had started this chase, the tiger was clearly losing ground, and the situation was escalating toward a potentially fatal confrontation. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel and don't forget to share it with your friends. The tiger stumbled, its injured leg finally giving way as it attempted to leap over a fallen log. David watched in horror as the magnificent predator rolled awkwardly, exposing the source of its distress, a deep gash along its left flank, fresh blood matting the orange fur into dark, wet clumps. The wound was severe enough to significantly impair the animal's mobility, transforming what should have been an apex predator into vulnerable prey. The rhino sensed the tiger's weakness immediately, lowering its massive head and charging with renewed determination. Its horn, David realized with growing alarm, wasn't just positioned to intimidate, it was aimed with lethal precision at the tiger's exposed abdomen. At this range and speed, even a glancing blow would likely prove fatal to the already weakened cat. David's binoculars revealed additional details that painted an even grimmer picture. The tiger was a female, probably around 8 years old based on her size and the wear patterns on her visible canine teeth. More concerning was the evidence of recent nursing. Her mammary glands were enlarged, indicating she had cubs somewhere in the surrounding territory. If this tiger died, her offspring would likely starve within days, unable to hunt for themselves or defend against other predators. The rhino's behavior became even more puzzling as David observed its methodical pursuit. This wasn't the explosive, short-lived charge typical of a startled or defensive rhinoceros. Instead, the massive herbivore demonstrated a sustained, almost calculated aggression that suggested something far more complex than a simple territorial dispute. Its ears were pinned back flat against its skull, and foam flecked the corners of its mouth, signs that David recognized from his military experience with animals driven beyond normal behavioral limits. Through his field glasses, David noticed something else that made his blood run cold. Embedded in the rhino's thick hide, just behind its left shoulder, was what appeared to be a broken dart, likely a tranquilizer that had failed to deliver its full dose. Someone had attempted to sedate this animal, but the procedure had gone catastrophically wrong, leaving the rhino in a state of chemically induced rage that would continue until the partial dose wore off naturally. The tiger made one last desperate attempt to escape, dragging itself toward a cluster of rocks that might provide some protection, but the rhino was closing the distance rapidly, its 2-ton bulk shaking the ground with each thunderous step. David realized with crystal clarity that he was witnessing the final moments of this encounter. Without immediate intervention, he would watch a mother tiger die, condemning her cubs to a slow death by starvation in the unforgiving jungle. Every instant honed through years of military service and wildlife training screamed at David to maintain his position. Protocol was clear. Rangers should never intervene directly in natural predator-prey interactions, and approaching a ranged rhinoceros ranked among the most dangerous situations possible in the wild. His radio crackled with routine check-ins from other rangers scattered across the reserve, their calm voices a stark contrast to the life-or-death drama unfolding mere meters away.
But as David watched the tiger struggle to lift herself behind the inadequate shelter of the rocks, another set of memories surfaced. Images of fellow soldiers who had been injured and cornered, dependent on others for survival. The unspoken code that you'd never abandon someone who couldn't defend themselves, regardless of species. His discharge papers had ended his military obligations, but they hadn't erased the fundamental values that had defined his service. The tiger's amber eyes met his through the undergrowth for a split second, and David saw something that transcended the barrier between human and animal consciousness. It wasn't anthropomorphizing to recognize desperation, the same look he'd seen in the eyes of wounded comrades who knew their situation was hopeless without help. This wasn't just another predator facing natural selection. This was a mother fighting to return to cubs who depended on her survival. The rhinoceros pawed the ground, preparing for what would clearly be its final, fatal charge. Its horn gleamed with deadly intent, and the broken tranquilizer dart protruding from its hide served as a reminder that human interference had created this unnatural situation in the first place. Perhaps, David reasoned, human intervention was also required to resolve it. His hand moved to the tranquilizer gun, checking the pressure gauge and confirming he had a full dart loaded. The weapon was designed for emergency situations exactly like this, though the manual had never specifically covered rescuing tigers from chemically enraged rhinoceroses. David took a deep breath, knowing that once he stepped from behind the tree, there would be no retreat and no second chances. David stepped from behind the saul tree, his movements deliberate and calculated despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. The rhinoceros was less than 20 meters from the wounded tiger, building momentum for its final devastating charge. There would be no time for hesitation, no opportunity to reconsider his decision. He raised the tranquilizer gun, steadied his breathing using techniques learned in countless combat situations, and fired directly at the rhino's exposed flank. The dart struck true, embedding itself deep in the thick hide just behind the animal's front leg, where the skin was thinner and the sedative could reach the bloodstream more effectively. The rhinoceros stumbled slightly but didn't stop, its chemically altered state making it resistant to the immediate effects of the tranquilizer. David had perhaps 30 seconds before the drug would take hold, 30 seconds during which an enraged 2-ton animal might decide to redirect its fury toward him. The tiger, startled by the sudden appearance of a human, attempted to drag herself further into the rocks despite her injuries. Her survival instincts recognized David as another potential threat, even though he'd just prevented her certain death. This reaction didn't surprise him. Wild animals rarely distinguished between helpful and harmful human intentions, especially when already traumatized and wounded. David backed slowly toward a cluster of sturdy trees, keeping the tranquilizer gun trained on the rhinoceros while mentally calculating escape routes. His military experience had taught him that even the best plans could unravel quickly, and he needed multiple contingencies. The rhinoceros turned toward him, its small eyes struggling to focus on this new target, but its movements were already becoming less coordinated as the sedative began to take hold. The radio on his belt squawked with an incoming transmission, but David didn't dare take his attention off the massive animal now swaying unsteadily in the clearing. Behind him, he could hear the tiger's labored breathing and the occasional scrape of claws against rock as she repositioned herself. The wound on her flank was still bleeding, creating a metallic scent that mingled with the earthy jungle odors. Minutes stretched like hours as the 3 unlikely participants in this drama remained locked in their precarious positions. The rhinoceros finally collapsed with a ground-shaking thud, its breathing deep and regular as the tranquilizer completed its work. David lowered his weapon but maintained his vigilance.
Sedated animals could still be dangerous if approached carelessly, and the tiger's condition remained critical. Now came the truly challenging part. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but David faced a wounded apex predator in an isolated location with no backup and limited medical supplies designed for human rather than feline injuries.
David carefully approached the wounded tiger, moving with the slow, non-threatening gait he'd learned during his wildlife training. The female remained alert despite her injuries, her amber eyes tracking his every movement while her body stayed pressed against the rocks. Blood continued to seep from the gash along her flank, and David could see that without medical intervention, infection would likely claim her life, even if the immediate bleeding stopped. His field medical kit contained basic supplies intended for human emergencies, but David had learned to adapt equipment for wildlife situations during his 3 years in the reserve. He slowly removed a pressure bandage and antiseptic solution, speaking in low, calm tones despite knowing the tiger couldn't understand his words. The tone itself might provide some reassurance, the same way he'd spoken to injured soldiers who were beyond coherent communication. The tiger's ears flicked forward slightly as David continued his gentle monologue, describing each item he removed from his kit. Her breathing remained rapid and shallow, but she no longer attempted to flee when he moved closer. Whether this indicated trust or simply exhaustion from blood loss, David couldn't determine. Either way, it allowed him to assess her injuries more thoroughly. The wound was deep but had missed any major arteries, explaining why she was still conscious despite the significant blood loss. David's military medical training kicked in as he identified the injury pattern, likely caused by another predator's claws during a territorial dispute, not the rhino as he'd initially assumed. The rhino had been pursuing an already wounded animal, drawn perhaps by the scent of blood or simply acting out its chemically induced aggression. Using techniques adapted from battlefield medicine, David managed to clean and dress the wound while the tiger remained surprisingly docile. Her eyes never left his face, and occasionally she would emit a low rumble that seemed more questioning than threatening. The antiseptic caused her to flinch, but she didn't attempt to strike or flee, as if understanding that his actions were meant to help rather than harm. As David worked, he became aware of sounds in the surrounding jungle that hadn't been present during the confrontation with the rhinoceros. Soft rustling in the undergrowth, the occasional snap of a twig, and what sounded like deliberate movement through the vegetation. His military instincts recognized the pattern immediately. They were being watched by multiple observers who were remaining carefully concealed. The realization sent a chill down David's spine as he finished securing the bandage. Tigers were typically solitary creatures, but the sound suggested at least 3 or 4 large animals moving through the jungle around their position. The first tiger emerged from the dense undergrowth like a living shadow materializing from the jungle itself. David's heart hammered against his ribs as the massive male stepped into the clearing, his golden coat unmarked by scars and his amber eyes fixed intently on the human kneeling beside the wounded female. This was easily the largest Bengal tiger David had ever encountered, probably weighing close to 500 pounds with muscles rippling beneath his pristine coat. Before David could fully process the appearance of the first tiger, a second one padded silently into view from the opposite direction. This one was smaller, likely a female, but her movements carried the fluid grace of a perfectly conditioned predator. Her gaze alternated between David and the wounded tiger behind him, as if assessing the situation with an intelligence that seemed almost human in its calculation. The wounded tiger beneath David's hands began to vocalize, producing a series of low chuffs and rumbles that David had never heard before in all his time studying tiger behavior. The sounds weren't distress calls or territorial warnings. They carried an almost conversational quality, as if she was communicating specific information to the newcomers about what had transpired.
Most wildlife researchers considered it virtually impossible outside of a few documented cases involving related siblings. The largest male took 3 deliberate steps toward David, closing the distance to less than 10 feet. Every instinct screamed at David to run, but his military training kept him motionless. Sudden movements around apex predators were often fatal mistakes, and with multiple tigers positioned around the clearing, flight was impossible anyway. The male's massive head lowered until he was at eye level with David, and for a moment that stretched into eternity, human and tiger regarded each other with mutual evaluation. Then something extraordinary happened. The male tiger stepped carefully around David and approached the wounded female, beginning to gently clean her injuries with his rough tongue. The antiseptic that David had applied didn't seem to deter him, and his ministrations were remarkably gentle for such a powerful predator. The other tigers maintained their positions, but visibly relaxed, their body language shifting from alert tension to something approaching acceptance. A fifth tiger, the largest female David had ever seen, materialized from the jungle behind him. She moved with the confident authority of a matriarch, and the other tigers subtly oriented themselves in deference to her presence. The matriarch tiger approached David with movements so measured and deliberate that each step seemed choreographed. She stopped directly in front of him, her massive head tilting slightly, as if studying his face with the same intensity he'd used to assess her injured companion. Then, in a gesture that defied everything David understood about wild tiger behavior, she slowly lowered her great head and gently pressed her forehead against his chest. The contact lasted only seconds, but the weight and warmth of the gesture conveyed something profound that transcended species barriers. When she stepped back, the other four tigers began a behavior that David would later struggle to describe to wildlife researchers. Moving in what appeared to be a coordinated pattern, each tiger approached him individually, touching their nose briefly to his hand or arm before retreating to form a loose semicircle around him and the wounded female. Over the following weeks, David's life transformed in ways he never could have anticipated. The 5 tigers began appearing regularly during his patrols, always maintaining a respectful distance but clearly shadowing his movements through their territory. Camera traps throughout the reserve captured unprecedented footage of the coalition working together to guide David toward poachers' camps, illegal snares, and injured wildlife that required human intervention. The wounded female, whom David had begun calling Asha, made a complete recovery and was eventually reunited with her 2 cubs in a joyful reunion that brought tears to David's eyes. But she never forgot her debt to the human who had saved her life, often bringing her cubs close enough for David to observe their development while ensuring they learned to maintain healthy caution around humans. Wildlife researchers from around the world descended on the reserve to study this unprecedented interspecies cooperation. The 5 tigers had essentially appointed David as an honorary member of their coalition, sharing information about threats to their territory and actively protecting him during dangerous situations. Videos of their interactions went viral globally, fundamentally changing public perception about the intelligence and emotional capacity of wild tigers. David's military medals had honored his service to his country, but the trust of 5 wild tigers became his most treasured recognition. Every morning as he began his patrols, knowing that unseen guardians moved through the shadows around him, he understood that his true mission had evolved beyond conservation into something approaching a sacred trust between species. The jungle that had once seemed vast and intimidating now felt like home, protected by the most powerful bodyguards on Earth. 5 tigers who had chosen to trust a human veteran with their lives, their territory, and their future. 6 months after that fateful morning encounter, David received an urgent radio call that would test the extraordinary bond he'd formed with the Tiger Coalition in ways he never imagined. A group of armed poachers had been spotted in the reserve's most remote sector, equipped with high-powered rifles and tranquilizer equipment specifically designed for capturing tigers alive for the illegal wildlife trade. The rangers were outnumbered and outgunned, facing criminals who wouldn't hesitate to kill anyone who interfered with their lucrative operation.
David arrived at the coordinates to find his fellow rangers pinned down behind their vehicles, unable to advance against the poachers who had taken defensive positions in a rocky outcropping that provided excellent cover and clear sight lines across the surrounding terrain.
The criminals had already set up a sophisticated trap system using recorded tiger calls to lure their prey, and fresh pug marks indicated that at least 2 tigers were moving toward the area, drawn by the deceptive audio signals. As David assessed the tactical situation, he noticed familiar shadows moving through the jungle periphery. The 5 tigers had arrived independently, their hunting instincts triggered by the unusual commotion and the presence of intruders in their territory. But unlike their normal behavior around humans, these magnificent predators weren't retreating from the conflict. They were positioning themselves strategically around the poacher's location. Asha appeared first, her recovered form sleek and powerful as she took position on a ridge overlooking the poacher's camp. The massive male David had encountered that first day emerged from dense vegetation on the opposite flank, while the other 3 tigers spread out to complete an encirclement that would have impressed any military strategist. Their coordination was flawless, each animal understanding their role in what appeared to be a deliberate tactical formation. The poachers, focused entirely on the human rangers they could see, remained completely unaware of the apex predators closing in around them. Their recorded tiger calls continued to echo through the jungle, unknowingly summoning the very animals they sought to capture. David realized he was witnessing something unprecedented in the history of human-wildlife interaction. Wild tigers actively cooperating with conservation efforts to protect their own species. When the first poacher spotted Asha moving along the ridge, his panicked shouts alerted the others to their perilous situation. Suddenly, finding themselves surrounded by 5 wild tigers with no escape route, the criminals' bravado evaporated instantly. Their weapons, designed for capturing animals from a distance, became useless against predators who had closed in within striking range using terrain and stealth tactics that rivaled any special forces operation. The poachers surrendered without firing a single shot, their hands shaking as they dropped their weapons and slowly backed toward the waiting rangers. The 5 tigers maintained their positions until every criminal was secured in handcuffs, then melted back into the jungle as silently as they had appeared. David later learned that this coordinated intervention had disrupted the largest poaching operation ever attempted in the reserve. News of the Tiger Alliance spread across international media, transforming David's remote Indian jungle into a symbol of hope for wildlife conservation worldwide. Scientists documented over 40 instances of the coalition actively protecting their territory alongside human rangers, behavior that challenged fundamental assumptions about predator intelligence and social cooperation. The wounded female Asha became a mother again, raising 3 healthy cubs who grew up understanding that not all humans were enemies. Their offspring learned to navigate the complex relationship between their species and the bipedal guardians of their forest home, creating a new generation of tigers who viewed conservation efforts as partnerships rather than intrusions. David's military service taught him about loyalty, sacrifice, and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. But 5 wild tigers taught him that these values transcended species boundaries, that trust could bridge the gap between natural enemies, and that sometimes the most unlikely alliances produced the most extraordinary results. Today, the Sundarbans Reserve remains one of the safest places on Earth for wild tigers, protected not just by human rangers, but by the descendants of 5 remarkable cats who chose to trust a veteran's compassion over 1,000 years of evolutionary caution. Have you ever witnessed an incredible moment of animal intelligence or unexpected cooperation between species? Share your experiences in the comments below. Your story might inspire our next video. And if this tale of interspecies trust moved you, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Together we can share more stories that remind us of the extraordinary connections possible between humans and the natural world. And since we can't choose your comment to mention in the next video, please share your experiences in the comments section of this video.